All right, this is a case study, right? We're talking about
I think so.
Case study.
Does anyone know what this talk is about? Andrew, do you know what this talk is about?
I think I know what this talk is about. It's about a civic tech project. It's about working together.
That's true.
It's about collaboration.
That's true. It's also about this.
Yeah. Well, indeed. Well, first, a little bit about us, who we are, what we do.
Yeah. So this is Andrew. Andrew is my friend. He's also a partner. He's also the CEO of Kalamuna and all the things at Kalamuna. He's a founder. He's a designer, a developer, a project manager. And let's see, he also appreciates fine cocktails. He likes long walks on the beach.
I do, yes.
And let's see. He also, you're a very fine dresser, which I think is why you get away with that mustache.
And this is my friend Michael. His mustache here is made of basil. He is an avid urban gardener. Indeed, I learned that his freezer contained over 4 quarts of homemade pesto. I don't know what room is left after that, but he's committed. Michael has been working for over a decade in the field of project management. At Exygy, he is the director of delivery, which means he makes everything happen, ultimately, empowers the team. And despite us crossing paths every day, going in opposite directions on the bar, we remain aligned on so many things, as I hope this talk will show you.
So let's talk about where we're from. This talk is brought to you by Exygy. So Exygy is a digital innovation studio. We're focused on building healthy, resilient communities. We focus mainly providing solutions in the health, civic, and ed tech space.
And as Michael mentioned, I'm the CEO of Kalamuna. Kalamuna is a digital agency. We partner with socially impactful institutions, associations, agencies, and governments to help them solve today's most pressing problems. And we do that by empowering them with research strategy, design and technology that will transform their organizations so they can deliver, they can better serve the needs of their audiences and communities.
Awesome. Enough with the commercials. Let's get back to the talk.
Big talk. What's this about? Well, we're going to tell you about lessons we learned working on this amazing project for the San Francisco Human Services Agency. You can visit the website at sfhsa.org. And HSA has a mission to promote the well-being and economic security of individuals, families, and communities in San Francisco. They do a lot. They help with food, health insurance, job training, a lot of really important human services.
Human services that are like CalFresh, Medi-Cal, CalWorks, Jobs Now, Project 500, Working Family Credit, the list goes on and on. The programs at HSA serve 250,000 people in San Francisco. Of a city of 800,000 people, that's a big percentage.
So this was a complex project. When we began, we saw that the content, the legacy content now was managed through a CMS long deprecated that had traded hands over many generations. And their output was not responsive, it wasn't accessible to the communities that needed that information the most.
I think it was called Red Dot, was the CMS. So it involved coordinating stakeholders across 3 different agencies: Kalamuna, Exygy, Lowercase Production, a 3rd agency. We had 3 different departments within HSA, and we were coordinating people across 9 different locations.
Overall, the project took 14 months, 5,000 human hours, which is a lot. I'm not quite sure how long that is in dog years, but
let's see, I think it's 8 years, 8.161 dog years, I think, Andrew.
Woof. This is the website we made. It's handsome. It's got many features. It's clean.
It's readable.
It's attractive.
It's responsive. It's easy to find things.
Where's the search? Oh, there's the search bar.
There it is.
That was very important. Finding things. Yes. So what did we learn? A lot. And what do we hope to transmit to you? Some. Takeaways from this talk. We'll be gaining an insight into what interagency collaboration can look like, what different models are available to you.
We're going to talk about navigating complex stakeholders.
And we're going to talk about moving at the pace of government.
And the power of like patterns and reusable components in our websites.
Last, we made some choices, and we want to explain how to support our choices.
So let's get into it.
Yes. So, really, why? Why do this? Why partner? There's work out there. We're looking for work. Why give it away to someone else, right? Why not just do it all yourself? Well, there are lots of reasons for that. Firstly, you may not be able to win the work on your own, particularly for very large projects. And by working together, we can present a really strong case for being able to serve the agency's needs. We can demonstrate a broader skill set than we could alone. Everyone says they can do everything, but I think there's a kind of earnestness once we pick a particular specialty and we present ourselves according to our strengths. Also, increasingly in very large projects, many institutions are seeking to break those projects apart into smaller units, typically along the lines of design and development. And if left out there in the wind, you may get random agencies who haven't worked together before suddenly needing to collaborate. And by providing a more unified front, not only are we able to provide ultimately more value to the client, but we're also able initially to help bring that overall cost down, which is not always understood because there's some complexity to transition between agencies. Our experience with it.
We also really love learning how our partners do things. And we love sharing with our partners how we do things. It makes us better, it makes the community stronger, and our craft better.
And it's also a really strong business decision for agencies. We're always looking to grow and grow into new areas, and sometimes it can demand quite a bit of investment to start doing something new. And we want to do things well. So being able to gain exposure into how our colleagues are doing those, taking on those activities from the inside, can let us gain insight into what it would take to get us up to their level, and whether or not it's even useful for us to think about exploring those other lines of business.
Yeah, it was a great partnership because Kalamuna brings to the table a deep knowledge of Drupal engineering work, and Exygy has a strong knowledge of civic and design work.
Yeah, we didn't have a lot of civic experience, though we have been engaged in nonprofits and mission-driven work. So, I don't think if we had been on this project on our own, we would have stood a chance. And I think the ways that we were able to complement each other, not only on the project, but in the bid, really helped us to win the project and learn quite a bit from each other.
Great work, Andrew.
Yeah, all right. Let's go. Let's do this thing. What types of partnerships are there? I think there are three major types. One is the joint bid. This is rarer. It's one that I do like. I like collaboration and equality. And it's usually when people go in kind of on even terms. And both agencies are bidding in parallel. Typically they have dedicated contracts with the client that can add extra dimensions of legality and bureaucracy. And it's one reason why many larger projects are pushed towards this other model, which is prime sub. If something goes wrong, when something goes wrong, something always goes wrong, there's a way to correct, and sometimes it's easier if there's only one finger to point in one location, and that's to the prime. The prime is the person, the organization that is ultimately legally responsible for the success of the project, and they contract out the other parts to those other agencies. In a prime sub relationship, the agencies represent themselves even though like a sub is a subcontractor, what I'm calling the subcontractor relationship is typically more like team augmentation, where those individuals working as subcontractors present themselves as though they were members of the agency for which they are contracting, deepening the bench or growing that model a little bit more. So yeah, prime sub is a little bit more common, and indeed this was what we took on in the course of this project.
Yeah, this project was prime sub, and at Exygy we mainly do prime sub and subcontractors, and occasionally we do the joint bids.
We're doing one joint bid right now as well. Ultimately, we can do more together than we can apart, and I think that's a really strong reason to collaborate.
Partners do more with less.
Yeah.
No, not that less. Different less. So next we're going to talk about our stakeholders. And Andrew, this is something we really did not do well on this project. We got some bumps and bruises.
We could have done better.
Could have done better.
We did well.
Yeah. So we didn't properly understand who the deciders were, who happened to also be sort of the funders. We also didn't involve them early enough in the process. We didn't properly gauge personality types, and that led to some deep criticism of the decisions we made. We didn't understand, like within the project team itself, we all brought different ideas of methodologies, and we didn't really respect those different perspectives when we started the project. So what we do now is a little practice called stakeholder mapping. And stakeholders, anybody heard of stakeholder mapping? Okay, great. I'll explain it a little bit. So stakeholder mapping is a design thinking tool that gets you to think about the humans and relationships beyond the org charts and the roles on the project. So we know when we start a project, we're going off of, we don't know the people we're working with, so we're going off of those org charts and roles. So we can start looking at a high level stakeholder map, and this is what you're getting in this project. It's like a 50,000 foot view. I know I've got a big circle of stakeholders. I know within that I have a project team and how they relate to each other, the internal project team, the vendor project team, the Exygy Kalamuna team. Then we know we have certain stakeholders that are going to be like subject matter experts. Those are the helpers. We have our funders, our leadership, and then we have this blob on the outside called external factors. And going into it, we really don't know what that is, but we know there's going to be external factors. Like with HSA, there was a big election that took place in 2016, and everyone thought they were going to lose their health care. And so our clients, that was a big part of their job, all of a sudden responding to people's fear of losing their health care, which was impacting their day to day, and being sensitive to that as people on the project is really crucial.
The map, it's like the beginning of Game of Thrones, power structure. Do you share this with the client sometimes?
That's a good question. So it depends. Ideally, yeah, it would be awesome to get clients involved in this process because we have personalities too. But it depends on what the risk is there, what the feeling is, and getting to know them personally. You get a sense of whether or not they'll like this or not like it. So as we iterate and go on this stakeholder map, we want to ask certain questions about who are the deciders, who are the approvers, who's working together really efficiently on the project, who are the troublemakers on the project, who are our technical contacts, and who are the people who are not being heard. Maybe they're quiet, but really important people. And then getting to know what those external factors are on the project. So this example is an example I took off the internet. David Naud's blog. He has a nice little write-up of how to do stakeholder maps. But you can see this is a mature project, iterated as you get to know your stakeholders. You're constantly asking those questions, and you're developing human beings. You're working with human beings that are breaking apart those org charts. So we see things like personality characteristics, We see things like, this person's smiling, maybe some people aren't so happy. The thought bubbles are great of like, sometimes people just have funny sayings that you can add, or dogmatic expressions that will come up sort of over and over. And then the arrows represent lines of communication. So sometimes those arrows are people reporting information sort of to other people. Sometimes those arrows can be bidirectional.
I don't know, this is like really, it's all hand-drawn, right? These are always kind of loose.
Yeah, I always do them hand-drawn because you're going to do them over and over in the project. I don't know, I guess there's no reason why you couldn't use software for this, but I like it hand-drawn. It's really an exercise that gets you to focus on individuals. So digging a little deeper into the project team itself, we want to think about like the methodologies that we're bringing to the table. And like how we approach different things. And so going through this process of like norming on those.
Yeah, this was a big one. You said norming, but I don't know if you've heard of the relationship stages of relationship building. Forming, storming, and norming. Those are kind of like rhythms you go through as you develop stronger bonds.
So Exygy came to the project with a very, we're really grounded in Agile and Scrum, and then Kalamuna came to the project with more of a Kanban, definitely Jira-focused workflow. And then with HSA, the organization is very waterfall organization, with some people bringing in Agile practices, so more of what we call a water Scrum practice.
Yeah. It's like you start the project and everyone's like, yeah, great. I understand what you're talking about. I understand what you're talking about. But and then practice, bringing all of those different points of view and philosophies together, that's really a lot more tricky.
Yeah,
for sure.
So remember, you work with humans. Care deeply about them, and constantly revisit those questions. So we know you can't run a marathon by sprinting. Do you run marathons?
Every day, metaphorically.
Yeah. So let's take a look at a typical timeline of a CMS project. There's content strategy, content governance, we have various design and build phases, and then we have some support. So you all have sort of this basic shape of a timeline in your head. So now a staffing plan, when you're planning out your staff for this project, it might look something typical to this. We've got the project team on the left-hand side, your engineers and your UX people, and you notice that this is regular intervals of people working about half time on a project, which works really great on an Agile project. And organizations that are not super complex or not averse to change. So it works on
like a textbook Scrum, right?
Textbook Scrum, exactly. Works really well on a product oriented project.
So then you throw the humans.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes when we're working with larger, complex organizations, this becomes hard to work at this pace because communications within the organization takes longer, scheduling meetings, user testing, the approval process of getting sign-off of features takes a lot longer, and that change management communication. You've experienced this before.
All the time.
Yes.
Yeah. Takes government. We're getting there.
So to help with this, we're starting, Kalamuna and Exygy are starting to prototype this approach that Andrew has dubbed the Sawtoothed staffing plan. This approach allows a staggered design and development process, which, to be clear, is a decidedly non-Agile practice.
But Agile, it's people over process, right?
Right.
At the same time.
True.
So we're trying to take into account.
Yeah, and this allows us to staff teams on other projects, sort of fitting in that Sawtooth schedule, which has some risks, right?
Yeah.
What happens if the Sawtooth does this?
Yeah. when those projects, if one project gets late, they can collide with the other projects. And this attempts to like reduce concurrency for some members of the team by letting them focus on one project 1 week or 2 weeks, and then another, theoretically, which we know helps bring focus and excellence to their work.
Yeah, and but you see it builds a lot of time into the project with relatively the same amount of hours. But please, like, if you do use this, use it at your own risk. We'd love some feedback on how it works for you. It's something that's still a work in progress for us. But you can see like some of the the data for it on our continuous staffing. We've burned about 1,100 hours in this 8-week period. But our Sawtoothed staffing, we've extended the project for twice as long, calendar-wise, and we're roughly burning 1,200 hours, so pretty close to the same amount. So,
yeah, we found things take longer than you think, but also trying to take into account the time that things really take, and trying to spread the work around.
So whether or not you choose to adjust your staffing plan or use some other method, you're going to need to adjust to the pace regardless. You will need to adapt to the pace. Okay.
Yes. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about patterns. I'm a fan of patterns, if you can't tell. We use a lot of patterns in this project because, really when you think about large problems, they can be overwhelming, right? We wouldn't get anything done if we think about how big a challenge is. By breaking it up into smaller units and smaller tasks, they become more easily to accomplish. This is, in essence, planning. If you conversely take all those small units and put them together, then you're building. And how do we build? Well, in a large ecosystem, think about using a framework. What do I mean by framework? Bootstrap, Foundation, these are popular front-end frameworks, and mostly what I'll be talking about right now.
Did you use Foundation for this shirt?
This is actually the latest Bootstrap. But I think there's another popular one that's come out in the last 2-3 years called the US Web Design Standards, and they're often touted as a great solution for government. They're more adapted to the federal space. It's very red, white, and blue. One of the great advantages of a framework is that, much like Drupal, they're put together by a community, and that community continues to work on and evolve those practices. They adhere to standards of accessibility and test those frameworks for them, make sure they work across different browsers. They solve a lot of problems that you don't need to create for yourself. And when we're working with large institutional websites, particularly those that don't renovate that frequently, using a front-end framework allows you to bring in those benefits over time as the front-end expression evolves. So it's a way of being a little bit more future-forward and providing some mechanisms to keep things fresh. You can save money on the project in that way. You can also offload part of the need for documentation to the framework itself. And later, should a pattern be needed that wasn't implemented in the original design, you may be able to find it in that framework if it's an accordion menu or some other novel form of navigation that you didn't implement initially. But it's just a starting point, really. A framework is just the scaffolding. We want to go further than that.
So I think I understand. By using one of these well-known frameworks, we're not reinventing the wheel, and like each time we do a new build, and like especially when it comes to accessibility.
Absolutely. Or user experience. Like this is government we're talking about. It's not really time to reinvent how users expect to work with the navigation and do some like radial navigation. We want to stick to patterns that are anticipated, predictable, and that really are an appropriate design solution. Second, there's a lot of talk of components, component-based architectures. It's like almost a meme, but there are some really important lessons that we learned about how technology fails.
Technology fails.
Maybe we can restore. sort of fate. Yeah, there's some really important lessons that we learned about the use of components in this context. Namely, clients expect and understand components. They're looking to other side. Escape. One more, please. Gotta bring the screen over together. Monitor first.
Okay, let's try this again.
So, the clients are looking for ways to understand the bigger system. They're involved in systems thinking. They don't really want to get really deep into the weeds when they're being creative about expressing their brand. They want to understand these larger units and these macro functions. And so components are a really natural way for them to wrap their head around what they're going to be doing and how they're going to be doing it. But in the context of an interagency collaboration, they provide a common language for us to both be focused on. We're not doing things in different ways. We're focused on building a bunch of things, and we talk about those things. And so we're working together on the same things, not just a bunch of random stuff.
It's like tying my shoes, patting my stomach at the same time.
How are we doing?
I'm there.
I think we're one slide ahead. Back. Two more. One more.
Back.
Yeah, back.
Okay.
Yeah. And last, we have some advantages when it comes to, how can I call it, scope creep, proliferation, especially when you're redoing a big site. There's always those weird little pages that are nested somewhere that get uncovered along the way, and they're like, oh, well, let's just redo this. It's like an oddball kind of thing, right? But once you engage in a component design driven process, then those ingredients just don't exist. It's like trying to make Mexican food with French ingredients. You just got to move on to eat something that will be equally delicious and get the point across. That's good. So once we have all these components in our minds and we've got them articulated, we want to pull them together and vet that strategy. We do that by prototyping, and we take the components, we put them in layouts, and we add the real content, and then you get these pages. The pages are in the web, or they can be lo-fi, hi-fi. Regardless, we're looking at this point to really validate our approach.
Yeah, so we love thinking in patterns too, because it provides this common vocabulary up and down the stack. So when our CSS coding is being made, we might use something called a section card that bubbles up to the HTML, which is the same. It bubbles into Drupal, so maybe a paragraph is named the same. So up and down the stack, our content authors are seeing the same name as how we're naming our CSS.
Yeah, so this project, it really helped all this come together. And we brought it together using a technology framework that is called calistatic, as we prefix most of our technologies. It is a tool, it is a framework, it is a way of building website and web app prototypes. It's also a static site generator, so we can produce the actual prototypes. Further, the code that we're using in the prototype is facilitated to come directly into Drupal. So we're not re-implementing the prototypes. The prototype code and all the twig templates get inherited by Drupal. And in the context of this website, which was executed in Drupal 7, and we'll get into that a little more later, we wrote a small module called twigshim, which natively loaded the twig templates in that environment. And this did a couple things, I think, for this project. One, it built more resiliency into the ecosystem by decoupling the front end more fully from the theme layer of Drupal. That opens up the possibility of a more easy move to Drupal 8, since their front end layer and all their components are already defined in a framework and a system that can then be re-implemented in that evolution. Yeah.
Let's see what it looks like.
Here's a little taste of some of the HSA backend. As you can see, each of the little components are defined, and we've got some markup. You'll notice there are some twig templates in here. There's one, but there's also some really ugly Drupal code. And this was one of the lessons that we learned in this project. You may or may not have learned this lesson yourself, but Drupal 7 throws a lot of really, I would say, lovely code and excessive divs at you that can be very difficult to tame. And one of the benefits of having this intermediary approach is that we could accept what Drupal was telling us, not fight it too hard, and seek to bring that code in and essentially work with it instead of trying to force Drupal to accept our beautiful hypothetical markup.
Yeah, it's really nice to see how Drupal 8 has really evolved to accept this kind of pattern thinking.
For sure. Yeah, so these are some of the lessons that we learned that were a little bit different from this project. I mentioned the Drupal 7. But another lesson is, well, it can be really hard to get full coverage in a style guide without dedicated budget for it. It's an approach that is increasingly popular, but I think it's really important to have clearly earmarked funds in order to go the distance on it. And we also, will acknowledge that when you are thinking in terms of components and these building blocks, you can start to develop some cookie cutter designs. Now, fortunately, we're working with really talented partners, and we're all very aware of these realities. But it's still something, to fight against, and something that demands a lot of consciousness.
Andrew, now that Exygy and Kalamuna have done a couple projects together, we're starting to really create a joint vocabulary of front-end components.
Yeah.
You know what that reminds me of?
Oh. Yeah. Jazz. Jazz. You and the jazz, man. Love the jazz. Just don't make me scat, Michael, please.
So when we started this project, something we really got off on the wrong foot is just supporting the narrative for the choices that we made. Mm-hmm. So because of this, two big narrative foobars happened pretty early on in the project. First was our choice of going with Drupal 7 instead of Drupal 8. And the second was around custom functionality, the way we told the story of custom functionality for the website.
I mean, I don't think that we made a bad decision going to Drupal 7. It was just more about how we socialized that decision ultimately.
Yeah, it was 2016 when we started the project. Not many Drupal engineers had experience with Drupal 8.
Certainly none of the internal teams in the city of San Francisco at the time.
And the module support at that time was just very limited. So the amount of extra coding that would go into working with these Drupal 8 modules it just didn't make sense.
Yeah.
So the problem was we didn't really, back to that stakeholder mapping, we didn't really know our stakeholders and probably ultimately didn't care deeply enough for them and who they were. And we didn't factor in personal biases that they would bring to the table, different experiences with CMSs like Squarespace or WordPress. And had we been empathetic about that, we would have told the story a little different, understanding that they were taking a hit on the admin side, but the complexity of the data structures really caused for a Drupal system. So instead of that, these personal biases were the narrative, and that really sort of was something that we constantly had to dig ourselves out of. So our second foobar was around custom coding versus leveraging custom modules. So technical folks are probably, I don't know how many are on the technical side in this room, but you're familiar with best practices with Drupal and using contrib modules, but clients may be sort of misaligned on the expectations around everything being custom for them.
And this isn't to say that like, we just started writing a bunch of custom code. It was just more around the expectation setting of what you can get easily from the ecosystem compared to the amount of effort that's required to create a fully customized experience and working within the budget and project constraints to achieve those goals.
Yeah, so that narrative swung from like the benefits of getting all this functionality from Drupal to sort of a missed expectations around a bunch of custom features that were going to be delivered.
Why can't it work this way? Why can't anything be made to work anyway?
So supporting our choices with data becomes really extremely important for supporting these narratives. So Andrew's going to walk us through a case study that you guys did at Kalamuna when you were helping a client select a CMS.
Yeah, I think greatly informed from our lessons on this project. We had an interesting situation recently doing some work for the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco here. And they came to us, they had an existing Drupal 8 website. They needed some updates, a refresh on the design of the front end. And so we built a prototype initially, and we launched the prototype. We made it live, and we're going to worry about the back end later. It really doesn't get more decoupled than that. So we really only had a front end, and this was all through Calistatic. And because it was really a single page application, it was quite appropriate. We were really easily able to launch and update that content. But as that model proliferates, the institution needs a way of managing and building those digital stories out. And we found that redoing the work in Drupal would be likely expensive and also perhaps see them meet the same fate that they had previously, that they were in to begin with, which is, they have an immovable back end and they want to innovate a lot on the front end. So we were seeking to have a more decoupled back end infrastructure, and we evaluated 6 different CMSs and gave demos to the client and let them play with the back ends to socialize how those different solutions were going to work. Created a matrix that we scored as well to help them think through those options. Looking at the size and effort of implementation for those different solutions, trade-offs around how easy the editorial experience would be, how media would be handled, whether or not some of and the pricing as well of those different options, and then the client selected the platform that they wanted to use, which in this case ended up being Gather Content, and we've been working to build some integration with Calistatic and Gather Content. And it's been pretty magical, but it was very useful to engage the client ultimately in that decision, because they're going to need to own this solution, and that building of consensus is really key.
Yeah, and we use a really similar process at Exygy where we factor in the needs of our stakeholders, and we basically provide a scoring across the different CMSs, so it becomes like a really non-biased, data-driven approach, and we'll just revisit it. We'll just revisit it throughout the project of like, oh yeah, that's why we did that.
And then later on, we made this decision together.
So clearly communicating up front that you'll be using community-based build contrib modules, really important. Making sure our engineers and designers are synced up so that the designers really understand what functionality the contrib modules will have out of the box is really important. And then making really conscious decisions where you're going to make a departure. And then,
and even when we were in the project, we found despite our best intentions, there wasn't enough overlap between the design and the development practices.
Yeah.
So we reformed that halfway through the project, and I think that's since been more institutionalized in the projects that you take on internally.
Absolutely. So what does that mean? So we're supporting our choices with data rather than just feelings, and we like it. So that's it. We wanted to open it up for some questions.
Thoughts, feelings?
The comment you made about having a common vocabulary between the two agencies, there's less confusion, everyone thinks they know what and they might be quite different.
That norming slide.
From agency to agency, but even within an agency, and also from the agency and the client, like it can be very, very different. Even the word design is super different from person to person. So it happens a lot. And based on your experience, how do you think that can be resolved? What would be an efficient and easy way to resolve that one?
Right. So my title at Exygy is Director of Delivery, and part of my role there is building out a delivery model for our organization, and that includes all of our activities, practices, deliverables, to slowly chip away at that problem of like, you know, we have 3 different, we have about 4 different on-staff designers, and like all these like words around like what is a mock-up or prototype or a visual design, a wireframe, like so creating this sort of standardized delivery model is how we're working on that, because we recognize that we have like we do a design sprint as an offering, but we've like really standardized that practice. But it's like we have hundreds of different activities that we do as an agency, and we've probably standardized like 10% of them, and then they're always evolving too. So I think it's like we really try to just be conscious of it.
Yeah, and if we do know any of those activities and we are able to label early on, communicating that in advance, early in advance in the proposal phase even, is something that we do to set expectations around that. So when things come up, there's at least some degree of familiarity with, oh, now we're here, or we're doing this thing. But it is a challenge, you know, the field of user experience and design is also constantly evolving. And if any of you saw Crispin's talk, he presented a map of 100 different such UX exercises that one could engage in. It would be a little bit of information overload to be throwing all of that into the mix without, you know, paring it down to what is initially needed. And then to your point earlier about internal nomenclature, you know, as we do more and more projects, those ingredients become, you know, they sit on the shelf longer, and people recognize them more internally, and that's certainly helpful. Though, of course, you want to fight against complacency and find the right balance between, you know, standardization and innovation.
Rob, you?
One client, just to change, like one client even asked for a glossary once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because we asked them for a glossary, and they're like, "Can we get one from you too?"
Sometimes I'll put together like a glossary of the project. Yeah, like just as kind of an internal thing. Although I don't see a problem with sharing that out too.
But it's important, you know, like I think there's you can, we're building complex systems, we're doing complex work, there is some vernacular, but regardless of how like inside we make that talk, it is important to encapsulate ideas. You know, that's kind of the nature of abstraction and language and creativity. So we take these ideas, they bubble up into these things, and that's the essence of the component-based design. I think like flattening everything that would be the old days, right?
Rob?
Yes. So with multiple partnerships, you end up with larger teams and more individuals who think what process actually means. How do you scale those teams without adding unneeded noise and disruption?
Do you want to fill that one?
I think that question is a delivery question, isn't it?
Sure.
I want to hear your delivery on it.
Cautiously. I think there's a tendency for like in agency land to like get people on a project as fast as possible because like our revenue margins are really thin, and so like, oh, those guys, they got to get on the like off the bench and working, and like I kind of counter that as much as possible and like slowly bring people into the project, because if you sit 5 developers on the project all at once, the designers aren't ready, the sort of sprint 0 activities aren't done, and we're just burning through budget. And so I try to like cautiously ramp up. It's like, you know, just throwing more engineers at a problem is not gonna get the breakfast cooked. You know, so it's like, okay, let's bring one more person in. Let's bring one more. Establishing some practices first, seeing how personalities are working.
Who was the prime in this relationship? Was Exygy?
Exygy was the prime in this one.
So you were running also then the kind of account management and the product ownership, so to speak.
Yep. Yeah.
Helen was doing more of the development.
Yeah, like that.
Did that Sawtoothed structure actually work? Did you get that to work in like over months?
So the Sawtooth structure is what we do now after being sort of like
project.
All right. But you're getting it to work.
yeah, we're having
It's
some
like
success
develop
with it.
2 weeks and they go on to a different project and then they come back.
Yeah.
And they go off again.
Yeah, and it's easy for us. We're like working on our team is always working on like 2 or 3 projects at a time.
So it'll be another project with a
Yeah.
similar sort of
Yeah,
fingers crossed that
It holds.
it's
yeah,
great.
But then, you know, theoretically, instead of working on 4 projects a week, you could be working on, you know, 1 or 2. And there's some clarity there and efficiencies to be had. We've been experimenting with it more in our support division, where there are, you know, a lot more clients, and it just doesn't make sense to have a slow trickle of trying to do things for everyone all at the same time. So we try and bring some focus periodically to the needs of those individual clients, alternate when those weeks are.
questions.
I guess I'm curious. I'm more just in the back end, and definitely talked a lot about design elements, like driven design. Although I know that also does definitely use that involves development for sure. In terms of like data migration from the old CMS, like all that kind of work with databases, server infrastructure. Do you feel that the design work was a much more significant chunk of the project, or was it fairly balanced? Just kind of curious.
No, I would say discovery and content were like a massive part of this project. Kind of, I would say more so than the design and build part of it. Yeah, LCP was our content strategy partner for this project, and they worked with clients for long after we left.
'Cause it sounds like in terms of the functionality of the site, it definitely wasn't a brochure site at all.
No. A lot of information on, like, basically steering people to the right programs, like finding, you know, like I'm a veteran, I need veteran services, like that's why that search bar is just so big. Just like get them into the search and have a powerful search. Yeah.
Was there a kind of a user account, you know, so people log into the site and manage their benefits from the city, or
No,
just information?
not for this one. Just the content authors. So if there's no more question.
I'm
Yeah.
curious, and I don't want to, break any confidentiality you have with your client, but the stakeholder map.
Mm-hmm.
What were some examples or some times where you really needed that tool?
I think around the example we gave with I'm really comfortable with like WordPress and Squarespace, and so my expectations are totally different. Not like really misalignment on that. There were some practices around like how like design thinking practices were it was definitely some misalignment of like what was design thinking, so kind of norming on those methodologies.
And even between our teams, you know, there
Yeah.
were members of our individual teams that had more, friction between each other and understanding and what their temperament was and which methodologies, you know, they preferred or how much control they wanted to have. It was something we, over time and through discussion, came to understand, but would have benefited perhaps from a little more deliberate and earlier vantage point on.
Kristen?
So what would you do different if you were doing a project again? What would be like the one big thing, like, okay, next time we're going to do this?
That stakeholder map would have been huge.
Yeah.
Like just really getting that down from the very beginning, and like the deciders and the funders were not involved kind of early on, and so we were kind of working with like a more insular group, and by the time we sort of had shared stuff with people who were sort of funding, they're like, this isn't what we're expecting. And so like bringing those deciders in like early, and sometimes it's hard. It's really hard because like they're busy.
Yeah. And I mean, there are a few things. I think I would have liked for Kalamuna to be more involved earlier in the project in some ways, and I think so. Exygy did have an engineer on the team that was also approaching part of the build process, and it was really great to have that partnership, especially early on as we were in conversations around hosting and having that proximity. But in some ways, I think it did put some strain on where the project leadership was from an engineering perspective, because they had such a close working relationship with the rest of the design team that I think doing it again, I probably might have pushed a little bit harder to make sure that we had really clear ownership and leadership of the engineering process on the Kalamuna side, because it was just
Too many cooks.
Yeah, too many cooks.
Too many engineers. So we have to let you guys go, but I do want to remind you, we're hiring. We're hiring a senior product manager and to work on great sites like this, especially somebody with some Drupal expertise. We're also hiring a lead engineer. Lead engineer. So thank you. Thanks, everybody.